In this, the second lesson in the course, A Critical History of Economic Theory and Policy, we will examine what some of the early political economists had to add to the writings of Richard Cantillon and their Physiocrats on the delicate problem of how nature, that is, the factor of production they termed land, should be treated. With over 6 billion people in the world today, one would think that issues relating to ownership of land and natural resources would be a subject of ongoing public dialogue and research by economists and other social scientists. While there is growing attention, particularly among environmental scientists and economists, the moral issues have yet to reach the level of importance they experienced during the 17th, 18th, and much of the 19th centuries, when so many people were being displaced by imperial armies and colonialism. War continues to force people to move from regions they have occupied for centuries with no security of their lives or possessions. What few of us realize is that despite the enormous size of the American hemisphere and the relatively low number of people in most regions when Europeans first arrived, by the late 17th century, a landed elite of European heritage was already well established, and large portions of the continent were claimed by this landed elite. In his study of revolutionary America, published in 1965, the historian Jackson Turner Maine detailed the origin and nature of the individual and family wealth that existed during that period. He wrote, "Even before 1700, good land in some coastal regions was unobtainable except by purchase from individuals. The price of land near the cities and along major waterways rose very rapidly. There are important lessons to be learned by looking at conditions in many countries, but the story of Ireland stands out because of the large numbers of people who died of famine or left to escape extreme poverty and starvation." Benjamin Franklin, representing colonial interests in Britain, paused from his work to tour Ireland in 1771. Any concerns he had over conditions at home were buried by what he saw in Ireland. He wrote, "If my countrymen should ever wish for the honor of having among them a gentry enormously wealthy, let them sell their farms and pay rack rents." Continuing, Franklin said, "Had I never been in the American colonies, but was to form my judgment of civil society by what I have lately seen, I should never advise a nation of savages to admit of civilization, for I assure you that in the possession and enjoyment of the various comforts of life, compared to these people, every Indian is a gentleman." And yet conditions even in England were for the majority nearly as terrible. In his introduction to the works of Thomas Paine, Howard Fast offered this assessment. London of the latter 18th century was, for at least half its population, as close an approximation of hell as is possible to create on this earth. The enclosure laws of the previous 2 centuries had created a huge landless population that gravitated toward the urban centers, mostly toward London, to form a half-human mob, not peasants, not craftsmen, the first tragic beginnings of a real working class. The Enclosure Acts brought almost all of rural England into private ownership of the nation's aristocracy. Displaced by sheep and cattle, peasants moved into the towns and cities, or boarded ships headed for one of Britain's colonial outposts. Historians estimate that between 1769 and 1774, some 10,000 people left Scotland for British North America. That number, or more, migrated from England. Despite conditions in the Old World, even Benjamin Franklin did not grasp how quickly the lands of North America would become the property of a relatively few. He wrote, "Land being thus plenty in America, and so cheap as that a laboring man that understands husbandry can in a short time save money enough to purchase a piece of new land sufficient for a plantation, whereupon he may subsist a family, such are not afraid to marry. For if they even look far enough forward to consider how their children when grown up are to be provided for, they see that more land is to be had at rates equally easy, all circumstances considered." Neither Franklin nor any others in 18th century North America could imagine the rapid population increase that came with large-scale immigration, resulting in the forced removal of the First Nations peoples and the rapid closing of the frontier, the disappearance of unclaimed land for settlement by the end of the 19th century. Franklin's view of the future remained optimistic. But notwithstanding this increase, so vast is the territory of North America that it will require many ages to settle it fully. Until it is fully settled, labor will never be cheap here, where no man continues long a laborer for others, but gets a plantation of his own. No man continues long a journeyman to a trade, but goes among those new settlers and sets up for himself. However, by the late 19th century, the reality in much of North America for the young and newly arrived was quite different from the optimistic picture painted by Franklin. Establishing colonies and encouraging migration of dissenters and others imposed heavy costs on empire-building governments, costs passed on to already poor populations, while benefiting a small minority in the home country. These issues were analyzed and treated by political economists in their writings. For nearly 2 centuries, North America and other colonies served as a safety valve to prevent serious threats to the status quo in Britain. The successful rebellion and somewhat less successful union by the American colonials shifted this balance of power. This point was made by economist Peter Drucker in the 1940s. Drucker wrote, "The American Revolution brought victory and power to a group which in Europe had been almost completely defeated and which was apparently dying out rapidly. The anti-centralist, anti-totalitarian conservatives, with their hostility to absolute and centralized government and their distrust of any ruler claiming perfection. It saved the autonomous common law from subversion under perfect law codes, and it reestablished independent law courts. Above all, it reasserted the belief in the imperfection of man as the basis of freedom." In other words, what happened in British America interrupted the course of history, at least for a time. However, the world's frontiers filled at an amazing pace. Sensing the time had arrived to overturn the old system of entrenched privilege, Thomas Paine returned to the Old World in 1787 with great hopes for the future. He was to become greatly disappointed. A few years into the French Revolution, he directly addressed and warned the French. "In my opinion, if you subvert the basis of the revolution, if you dispense with principles and substitute expedients, you will extinguish that enthusiasm and energy which have hitherto been the life and soul of the revolution, and you will substitute in its place nothing but a cold self-interest, which will again degenerate into intrigue, cunning, and effeminacy." Paine would live to see the French people once again come under the control of a strong central authority, Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1795, Paine decided to challenge the basis for private appropriation of the earth in the pamphlet Agrarian Justice. In this pamphlet, he wrote, There could be no such thing as landed property originally. Man did not make the earth, and though he had a natural right to occupy it, he had no right to locate as his property in perpetuity any part of it. Neither did the creator of the earth open a land office, from whence the first title deeds should issue. Paine, in Agrarian Justice, and other writings demonstrated a remarkable understanding of the principles of political economy. He was also one of the great moral philosophers of the ages, whose principles I have come to describe by the term cooperative individualism. More than John Locke or Adam Smith, Paine provided a blueprint for just reforms. Where control over nature, that is, over land, was concerned, Paine asserted that every proprietor of cultivated lands owes to the community a ground rent for the land which he holds. The aggregate ground rent collected by government would, Paine argued, constitute a fund to provide pensions for the elderly, trust funds for the young, and for other social services. This was Paine's vision for what today we might call social democracy. What these thoughtful leaders faced all around the world were societal elites prepared to do whatever was required to protect their privileges. They needed intellectual allies and were prepared to pay handsomely for their support. The intellectual battle would always be between those who felt compelled to defend the status quo and those who argued for reforms, whether incremental or radical. We reach the end of Lesson 2.